This is Katrin with Disability Rights New York. Welcome to our podcast, Empire State of Rights, closed captioned, for a featured episode of the Director's Chair. These episodes feature our Executive Director, Tim Clune, who invites special guests to discuss important topics in our united work for disability rights and advocacy within our community. Today, we welcome our guest, Juan Pablo Salazar, a global disability rights activist who has a long history in advocacy and is currently the inclusion coordinator for the Latin American Development Bank. Juan Pablo, Tim, thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you, Katrin. Pleasure to be with you guys today.
Always fun to be here, Katrin. Thanks.
Juan Pablo, would you start off by telling our audience a little bit about your career as a global activist for the rights of people with disabilities, and also talk to us about how your advocacy career began and what has your journey been like?
Well, it's been a long journey. I've been like a couple decades on this, and I've been lucky enough to work on disability rights from different trenches. So first I started from civil society. I founded and ran an NGO in Colombia for maybe 9 years or so. And we did have some regional projects, mostly with international cooperation agencies. This kind of got me on the radar of the public sector. And President Santos, back in the day, invited me to be his advisor for disability policy. So I did that transition from civil society to government. And well, you know, it's a role game, no? Politics is a role game. So when you're in civil society, you say to the government that nothing works. And when you're in government, you tell civil society that everything is just fine. So to transition to both places, I think was a good experience. First to do the advocacy of what should be happening, and then try to make the changes within the machine that you are trying to change. So I did that for his presidential term, and that kind of got me in the international radar. And I ended up working at the multilateral development banks. So first at IDB, based in Washington, DC. And I just started this new job at the Latin American Development Bank, based in Buenos Aires. So the job is to help countries in the region implement the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So give them technical advice, coordination, and of course, the funding for this important agenda. So, you know, that's the summary, the irresponsible summary of 20 years of my life.
It certainly has been a long journey. And Tim, both you and Juan Pablo have had several decades in this area. As you look at the work that you both have done, let's talk a little bit about the notable changes we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years. As you've seen as self-advocates, and also let's talk about the work that still needs to be done, because we're still in the business of doing it, aren't we?
Again, according to where you are sitting, you have different responsibilities and different indicators. So when you're in civil society, your mentality is more in a project-based, which is pretty cool, because you get to affect the lives of a certain limited community, but a community that you know. So the impact of your work counts in lives that you see. And when you go to the field, you see that your projects, you know, got jobs to this many people, promoted this social disability inclusion committees and whatnot. Maybe the one I'm the most proud of is we did a project to start wheelchair rugby in South America. So, you know, we got the US team and the Canada team to come down south and teach us. And we started a league. You know, 10 years later, we're part of the Pan American Games. And I know that the impact of that particular project is going to outlive me. So that's one example of many of specific projects that have affected specific lives. When you go to public office, it's more intangible, it's more ethereal, because you work in public policy. So, you're 4 years working in a project to advance a legal capacity bill, and your fights are to, get the debates passed in Congress and convince the senators and whatnot. And maybe that's going to be more impactful and it's going to last longer than the works that you did in civil society, which were project based. But you also don't get to see the lives of the people you affect because it's more intangible. Similar when you work in multilateral organizations and you design like massive projects that are, a lot of bigger projects, big budgets, but you don't see the changes. Both are important. All are important. You need the grassroots activism. You need the public policy, and you need the massive budgets, international cooperation budgets to implement that public policy. So I'd say, where are we? We are in a glass half full kind of deal. I'd say, the Americas region, Latin America looks great on paper, meaning our bills and our legislative and normative agendas are state of the art, but the implementation is tougher. So when it comes to accessible infrastructure, inclusive education, legal capacity implementation, and all of that sort of stuff is still looking great only on paper, but still a long way to properly implement and see those changes. But then again, these specific examples are just symptoms of the true problem, which is the cultural mindset, the perception of people with disabilities in the region. I believe that the social model of disability is difficult to understand. It's a sophisticated model to understand that disabilities are not within people's bodies, but on the barriers that are on the context, on the environment. So I think that message is still only on the disability rights people, organizations, activists, DPOs, and whatnot. But we preach too much to the choir, and I don't think that message is like massively accepted and understood on the culture. So I think that's where we need to work the most.
So Juan Pablo, thank you so much for that. You're a hard act to follow, but what I will say is very similar things are happening, in our global sphere here, and in New York specifically, and in more general terms across the U.S. We have some laws on the books that look good, but the implementation is certainly lacking. But we also have some laws on the books that are pretty archaic, and in fact go to the heart of, self-advocacy, individual determination, the right to live in the community, to have control over who you marry, what you spend your money on, all of those things. So New York in particular has a guardianship statute, and you referenced, decision making. And the guardianship statute in New York is one of the most restrictive in the country. Basically, someone can fill out a piece of paper, go into court, and for someone who has an intellectual or developmental disability, can, without any due process, and I don't mean to be hyperbolic, but for the most part, without any due process, can lose their decision-making rights. We have focused, over the years in individual cases. So in the context of self-advocacy, people hearing about Disability Rights New York, contacting us, or the courts who have some concerns about some individuals with these guardianships that might not need them, we have gotten involved and have been able to have these guardianships dissolve and have people regain all of their decision-making rights so that they can live the life that they should have been able to live, for the past decade. We can do better. We must do better. So this year is the 50th anniversary of Geraldo Rivera had taken a camera onto the grounds of the Willowbrook School, and he uncovered abuse and neglect. As a result of his reporting, our network was created. So Disability Rights New York, the protection and advocacy system was born because of that. But those facilities had lasted for decades prior to his expose. And I joined this network in 1990. And the issues that I dealt with back in the 90s are similar to what we are still looking at today. And it is, on the one hand, disheartening. On the other hand, it's a motivating component for me and the people I work with. And I often joke with, our staff that my job as executive director is to put us out of business, right? But I just don't see that happening anytime soon. But what it does is it just makes us be that much more vigilant and aggressive to ensure that people get to make the decisions that they're entitled to make. And that, as you said, the barriers that exist are things, there's no reason for them to exist. And we can and must do better.
Tim, your response leads me right into my next question. And really, there's some timely things that have been happening around guardianship, and on the other side of the country, with Britney Spears and Amanda Bynes talking about conservatorship. As we think about the awareness of decision making, and as you referenced, we're in the 50-year anniversary of this expose on Willowbrook. I think about technology, I think about awareness, and how it is that over the last 30 plus years, things have changed. When Geraldo Rivera did his expose, it was one man, one camera bringing this story. And now we have social media, we have a lot of cameras, we have a lot of people who are bringing attention to all of these issues. Juan Pablo, Tim, talk to me about what you feel the role that technology has played. Has it been more of a service or disservice to the activism, not only for both of our organizations, but also for self-advocates?
Well, I would say that it's hard to judge by itself, meaning it's a means and not an end. It's great that more people have more access to broadcasting, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the messages that they convey are going to be good. Meaning guardianship and Article 12 of the Convention for the CRPD nerds out there is difficult to understand and to interpret. So you do need people speaking about it. And I would say cases like the Britney Spears case bring a light and make us talk more about it and try to, deal with it as a society. But I would say that, like not all Black people are activists of African-American rights, or not all gay people are super active in the LGBTQ plus community. I would say it's the same for people with disabilities. Not all people with disabilities are really into all the specificities of guardianship specifically, which again, I think it's the toughest to understand. So it's good that technology gives us this tool, but I would say it has to be accompanied by education by the activists and the people with disabilities that are claiming those rights to do it properly. Because it's also very easy to fall into old and stereotypical portrayals of people with disabilities, and that can go terribly wrong. So yeah, more power to the technology out there and to the people using it. But if it's not done on alliance with the messages of public policy, I think there's a danger to it as well.
So there are always pluses and minuses, and what I'd like to focus on is the access to technology. There are a lot of people who have access to iPhones or whatever kind of immediate internet capability that exists with the phone that they have. However, there are so many communities in New York State and across the country that have no access to high-speed internet, where a lot of information can be disseminated and obtained to help foster and advance the movement for civil rights for people with disabilities across the country. So what we have seen in New York is, yes, the urban areas may have more, but the rural areas in New York State, there's a dearth of accessibility there in terms of the internet. Just as an example, Juan Pablo, we had sued the governor of New York State because he failed to have an American Sign Language interpreter on screen during his live TV press briefings during the early days of the COVID pandemic. And we contacted the governor's office and we advised him that this was unacceptable and they needed to fix it. The response was, people can go on the website and there is an in-screen interpreter there, but it completely ignores the issue of whether you have access to high-speed internet and can get it, let alone whether you have a computer that can do it. Right? The list goes on. There are a lot of people in the community who use rabbit ears and their TV to get news. And we can't be that myopic and not really realize that that is a large group of the population who rely on that type of technology to get their information. And I would say in part because it's not otherwise available to them. So we need to do better to make sure that people can have access to that information. I think on balance, I try to focus on what are the positive aspects of technology and how we can use it and deal with the outliers where something may go awry because of technology. When all is said and done, if video phones are depicting the actual events of what's happening, that is a good thing, for good or bad, right? Because we need to deal with the accuracy of the environment as opposed to things that might not in fact be true because they've been distorted for one reason or another. So I think it's a positive.
Well, and Tim, you bring up another good point around access to technology, certainly, and also the accessibility of the technology that we have as well. And as we look back over the last 2 years and when we were first presented with COVID-19, certainly there were a lot of issues that everyone had to really deal with and look at differently. And certainly COVID is still very much part of our lives. Let's talk about the impact that COVID had on our communities, not only presently, but how really we need to look towards the future about whether it's other possible pandemics or natural disasters or any type of emergencies. There's a lot of things that need to be done differently. Let's talk a little bit about that and how we can make sure that information is accessible to everyone.
Well, I would start by saying that maybe what COVID did was put a spotlight on the gaps that people with disabilities have to access their rights to health. So this was going on before COVID, and COVID just exacerbated those gaps in accessibility, in training of the professionals, and of course, during especially the first months of the pandemic, when we didn't have just enough information to understand what to do, well, people with disabilities were disproportionately impacted not only because of the lack of reasonable accommodations to access the health system in general, but with other day-to-day things. Like, for example, people with disabilities that require personal assistance that would need to go home and to move around the city probably is spreading the COVID. So I think that it's good that we put a spotlight on that, so we as a humanity can work to bridge those gaps and bring those reasonable accommodations to the health system. But to go on a more positive note, I think that another very, very important legacy of the pandemic is the fact that we all culturally went through the experiment of understanding telework. And I think that's a very massive plus for the community of people with disabilities, because we proved we don't need to, physically be at the workplace, but we can telework and, deliver quality to the laboral force. So yeah, the good and the bad. I think again, we need to revise those reasonable accommodations missing, so that people with disabilities can access their right to health. But the blessing in disguise is we saw how to access more our rights to the labor markets.
Juan Pablo, you make such an excellent point, because we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was passed in 1990, and I started this job in 1990. So that was a law that came into being the same time I became a staff attorney with the Protection and Advocacy System. And for more than 10 years, we spent the fight just trying to establish what qualified individual with a disability meant. That was the language in the statute. So we never got to the merits of whether an individual was entitled to a reasonable accommodation or whether they had been discriminated against in the terms and conditions of their employment. But we spent a decade fighting over whether you were a person who was covered by the ADA. A complete waste of time. And it was something that the courts, they were not prepared to enforce in the broadest sense this historic civil rights legislation. So that was one thing. You touched on something that has always been an issue when we have had employment cases, and a reasonable accommodation request has been to work remotely, work from home. And the explanation was always, no, there's no way you can do that job from home. I need you in the office. You have to do that work here. Well, you are absolutely right that this pandemic has blown that defense to pieces, because what we have demonstrated over the past 2 years is that productivity can still be in the forefront, and accessibility and accommodations can likewise be, addressed. So that part has been a plus. I am hopeful that we can, move forward. But I think one of the biggest obstacles that we have seen is that people with when policies are created, people with disabilities are the first to be impacted and the last to be considered. We have fought to be at the table when policymakers are making decisions regarding, the communities that we work and live in, to have a voice, to have communication there, so that it's not an afterthought. And we have fought very hard for that to happen. And in New York, our Department of Health had put out during the pandemic, although it was created before the pandemic, but it was about the allocation of ventilators. So during COVID, a lot of people, because of the effects of COVID, necessitated the use of being intubated and then being on a ventilator. Well, there were guidelines in New York that ostensibly allowed the rationing of private ventilators if you had gone to a medical facility and someone needed it more than you. Well, it seems to me if someone is using a ventilator, how could it be that they need it more than I do if I'm already on it? That begs the question, but the way these guidelines were written, they were certainly written in a way that had a discriminatory effect on people who used ventilators. We brought a lawsuit against New York State, claiming that these guidelines were illegal. And the court dismissed our case because it said the case was not right, which means that our clients had not suffered any injury at the time. Therefore, there was no basis for the lawsuit. And if you carry that to its logical, extension, it would mean that our clients would have to go into the hospital, have an extubation, have their ventilator removed, and most likely die before they could bring a lawsuit. It just makes no sense that is what the legal standard is. So obviously we are appealing that to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals because it just doesn't make sense. For us, we are going to demand to be at the table when these discussions are happening so that emergency preparedness is not an afterthought. We saw it happen in our congregate care facilities in New York State when this pandemic hit. We have been vocal advocates that congregate care is an archaic model of care that we need to no longer be relying upon. The economy of scale to save money, to be able to provide services to a group of people does not outweigh an individual's right to live in their own home and age in place. We have the technology, we know how to do it. The people who are making policy have just not grasped how can I say this? The will of the people who deserve an opportunity to live in their own home. And that's what should happen. And for us, that is a clear goal in the future, and especially in this 50th anniversary of Willowbrook.
There's certainly still a lot more work to be done. Juan Pablo, Tim, thank you so much for your time today. I would love to have another conversation in the next coming months and revisit some of this with you. Thank you so much, both of you, for your time today. I look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you for having us.
It was great to meet you, and thank you for being here today.
Empire State of Rights Closed Captioned has been brought to you by Disability Rights New York, your source for disability rights and advocacy. If you enjoyed our program, make sure to subscribe, like, and share this post. If there is a subject you would like us to discuss, please email podcast@drny.org or comment below. Tune in next Wednesday, where we'll bring you more information on disability rights in the state of New York. The closed captioned and ASL version of this podcast is available on our YouTube channel. To listen to more Empire State of Rights closed captioned, follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.